morning. What a warm welcome from everybody. Thank you very, very much to Bench Events for inviting me to come and be the opening speaker this morning to give you a short overview of the African macroeconomic position and situation. It's a pleasure for me to be back in Rwanda. And again, I was here last night at the awards ceremony, which was terrific. I'm just sorry I didn't get an award, but absolutely terrific. And what struck me again about Rwanda is simply the commitment to excellence. Excellence in everything that occurs in this particular country. So as someone who comes from South Africa, I can really see competition in the African environment across so many different aspects. I'm delighted to be here. Again, I'm delighted to be with Bench Events again, and thank you very much for inviting me to come back to address you. I'm going to be talking about the broader African economic trends, and really I've called the presentation a stagnation or star nations. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of speculation about this issue or notion of Africa rising. All of us Africa analysts over the course of the last number of years spoke glowingly about these endless trend lines that were increasing in terms of economic and GDP performance. The real question is it sustainable? Because there has been something of a shock to the system in a number of African countries over the course of the last 24, 36 months or so, and I'll come to that during the course of the presentation. But in my presentations, I like also to compare Africa with what's happening in other parts of the world. And for some of us who work on this continent and experience the difficulties on this continent on a regular basis, let me just tell you that it doesn't necessarily matter where you are in the world today. Strange things are happening absolutely everywhere. And sometimes when you compare some of these global trends that are occurring, question marks about leadership going forward, question marks about policy implementation going forward, whilst Africa used to bear the brunt of so many, I suppose, negative inferences, well, the rest of the world has their problems as well. The United States, certainly for the moment, under new and very different leadership, many questions being asked into the future. That's an X-ray of the British Prime Minister's foot, Theresa May's foot, after she shot herself in the foot by calling an early general election only a few months ago. Well, issues surrounding Brexit and indeed her own political fortunes, very uncertain as I stand here on the stage. And of course, the world itself is undergoing a very stressful period as the bellicose rhetoric between these leaders over the issue of North Korea and the missile and nuclear crisis in that particular region creates a degree of volatility and instability. So when you put some of these big picture issues together and you bring it back to our continent here in particular, well, funnily enough, things look that little bit more stable in part, although I will raise some concerns during the course of this presentation. From a global economic point of view, though, things are ticking along quite nicely, and it is important to set Africa within the context of a pretty decent overall global performance. Despite our issues, or some of our issues, I should say, among some of us, with the new US president, the US economy has been performing extremely effectively. And indeed, if policy choices are correct into the future, that economy could grow and grow substantially. US employment is close to full. Eurozone growth looks pretty good or pretty healthy as I stand here. That's relatively positive for all of us. China is still growing relatively well. I'll come back to China in a moment. And emerging markets overall, which had gone through something of a torrid time in the last 2 years, starting to look that much better. And we've seen large amounts of capital inflows coming into emerging markets. Africa as well, looking that bit better this year and into the next few years. I'll come to that shortly as well. The US economy is set to grow at about 2.5% more or less GDP this year. It needs to grow at more than that if Mr. Trump wants to be able to invest sufficiently in infrastructure, which is one of his core programs into the future. Eurozone economy now growing at better than the stats on the screen at about 2% projected for this year. Quite impressive growth growth figures. The one thing about Africa, of course, is that African growth looks a lot better this year and the projected growth into the next few years. But the good years for Africa, those good years between 2005 and 2015, more or less, were built on the back of three key features. One, certainly, the improvement of governance on this continent. So there was an inward improvement as to why Africa started to rise. But there were two external factors as well. The global credit crunch forced investors to look elsewhere, outside of the Western world, and that shifted capital across to this particular continent. Secondly, China's rise shifted Chinese interests into this continent as well. So on the basis of those three key sort of indicators as to why Africa had done so well for that period, 2005 to 2015, we may well see some trends or changes. The first trend or change that I do expect to perhaps hit us all is the advent of rising interest rates in the United States. If that US economy does tick along quite nicely as expected, we've seen already indications from Janet Yellen that those interest rates in the US will start to rise, perhaps incrementally again by the end of the year. I asked the question rhetorically, is Africa ready for rising US interest rates? Because to a degree, the higher interest rates in the US might prevent some capital from coming into this continent, as indeed investment opportunities back at home look that little bit better. The return on investment is a little bit better. So ironically for our continent, the worse it is in the United States, or the worse it is in the Western world, the better it is here, because the growth opportunities are here. I caution, and I put that in as an issue of caution into the future. I also put into the equation, in terms of being cautious, issues surrounding protectionism and indeed a populist movement across the world, perhaps epitomized in the United States, where borders are being put up rather than being taken down. And that's not necessarily a good sign for a more global or expansionist view of integrating Africa into the global economy. And I think we have to be aware of that and flag that as an issue going forward. And whilst the detail on the slide is simply too small to really delve into, I do remain concerned about the role of aid, development aid, coming into this particular continent, and how politically popular that is at home in terms of the aid donor countries. And we've already seen the United States perhaps call into question issues regarding the pumping of large amounts of money into the developing world and into Africa going forward as well. Let's flag that as an issue to watch over the course of the next year or so. Across in the United Kingdom, and one has to have a sense of humor about some of these issues, I work with them every day, believe me, you need a sense of humor. Across in the United Kingdom, this uncertainty is going to be with the UK, and for that matter, perhaps with the related negotiations into Europe for the next number of years. We've already seen Britain's GDP take something of a knock, and we are seeing the beginnings of a more negative or incrementally negative effect of Brexit on parts of the UK economy. We'll flag that into the future because it is important when it comes to the UK doing trade deals now outside of the confines of the EU, and the question is whether the UK will be able to forge a more independent trade policy between herself and other individual African countries, or for that matter, African trading blocs down the line. The UK think they can do it, and it does offer some opportunities for Africa to engage in future directly with the UK. Across in Europe, things are looking a lot better. Well, are they? Yes, I think they are. Populists, right-wingers, ultra-conservatives, ultra-nationalists have to a degree been put to bed in the Netherlands and in France. Of course, this was upset perhaps 10 days ago during the German elections, in which the more ultra-nationalist movement, the AfD, won a substantial amount of support and entered the Bundestag for the first time. So I think issues of nationalism, and again how European countries relate to the developing world and to Africa, will perhaps re-emerge over time, but for the moment, better growth rates coming out of the Eurozone bode well for Europe's relations with Africa. The Chinese economy has been interesting. It's been creaking and cracking and mutating and changing, and I do love that about China. That Chinese GDP, the headline figure, which is now about 6.5, 6.6%, is pretty good for a country of 1.3 billion people. Yes, the GDP is down from those heady days of 14 or 12%, and the projections for Chinese GDP are lower than the current 6.5% into the future, but it is still pretty impressive and pretty solid going forward. But as I'm an analyst, I must highlight some of the caveats to all of this. Corporate debt levels in China have been soaring, and this has meant that a swathe of new regulations being passed by the Chinese government look as though they are going to provide some pullback on this debt that has largely been accumulated by private sector firms operational across the world. So I have again a modicum of concern about the effects of new Chinese regulation on gross fixed investment coming out of China, and the effects of that on the Chinese expansion and continued investment into this continent. But still, when you look at those big picture figures and you look to see what China did on the African continent over the last 12, 18 months or so, China has been the largest job creator on the African continent in 2016, and it is today the largest investor in terms of capital investment on the continent. Quite remarkable. That commitment, I would argue, to Africa, I think the commitment is going to change and mutate, but it remains pretty solid going forward. So with that very brief overview, let me just come to some of the more interesting, that I think, some of the more analytical aspects of where the continent is at the moment. I always show this map, and I've been showing this map for many years just to introduce aspects of Africa, just because some people across the world need a geography lesson in how big and how complex and how overarching this particular continent is. I like, with apologies to my friends from the United States here in the audience, I like to show this map when I'm in the US, because very often Americans need a geography lesson just to show them the context. China fits in terms of its landmass onto the continent, along with the US. The whole of Western Europe can fit into most of North Africa, and the UK fits quite nicely into the island of Madagascar. It just gives one some context about the sheer size and, I would argue, complexity. So to do a half-an-hour talk on Africa, I might add, perhaps something that one shouldn't even attempt. We have seen disappointing growth figures from the continent over the course of the last 24 months, and indeed, much of this is associated with the commodity super cycle that has slumped, and countries that have simply been unprepared for that slump in commodity prices. By and large, the big economies of South Africa and Nigeria, and to some degree Angola, dragging down those overall growth rates for the continent. It's added to a steep depreciation in many African currencies and an added volatility in currencies as well. And those of you working indeed in the Nigerias or Angolas of this world will know exactly what I mean. Well, again, the news has been mixed, I must tell you. African debt has been on the rise, and this issuance of sovereign bonds denominated in US dollars, which has become one of the core underpinnings of the developmental state of so many African countries, now means that high debt levels in African states will demand repayments of these debts. And as the US dollar increases in value, this in itself could have an effect on the ability of states to repay various loans. I flag this as an issue going forward. The good news, if you think all I'm presenting to you are concerns, is that we perhaps have turned the corner. There is a commodity uptick, although I don't believe that uptick is quite as dramatic as many African countries would like. Still, the figures look better for this year and into next year. And that, to a degree, is helping some of these big commodity-dependent economies start to show some green shoots. There's a long way to go in Nigeria. From the heady days of 6 or 7% GDP growth, Nigeria now looking as though it may do 1% growth if we are lucky. At least it's out of what has been a debilitating and depressing recession. The same can be said for South Africa. Again, one of the major economies. I'm from Cape Town, I might add, and we have been consumed in South Africa with issues of how to kickstart our economic growth, how to get out of the malaise that we have been in. Malaises that exist really have two components. One is policy, good policy, and the second malaise clearly is good governance from the political side of the equation. Both those two issues will be tested in South Africa over the course of the next number of months. Regional growth, therefore, for 2017 across the board looks a lot better. You can just see here the little dip in 2016, which is the dip that we've experienced, and you can see the trend lines for the major regions of the continent looking that bit better. Just note the blue line, which has been the constant throughout East Africa. East Africa, not reliant upon commodities, a net importer of core minerals like oil for that matter, taking advantage of a lower oil price. And these economies along this corridor are more diversified. And if I could imprint that word diversified in every single government office across this continent, that to me is a core issue that needs to be accomplished. Diversify the economy so as not to rely upon what you take out of the ground. With all said and done, we still see substantial investment interest on the continent. The Economist's recent survey on whether business leaders were going to pump more money into the continent was very favorable indeed, in particular for East Africa and for West Africa. And I would argue that there are green shoots perhaps across the continent in the other regions as well. Yes, foreign investment was down in 2016 in terms of overall projects, but the amount spent on capital investments coming into the continent last year remained indeed very, very buoyant and hit record levels. So there remains a sense of optimism. There remains a sense that the African rising narrative is fairly solid. But growth paths across this continent are diverging. It's not as though I can paint Africa with one brush, and it would be naive of me to do that. Those countries that are oil exporters who rely upon that natural resource are the ones that have suffered because they haven't diversified. It's easy for me to tell a country to diversify. I'm an academic. I can't wave a magic wand. But those processes needed to have been in place 10 years ago, and if they're not in place, they need to be in place now for the future. Oil exporters have been the ones to feel the brunt of all of this. The rest of Africa has ticked along at relatively good growth rates. But I think really the opportunities are going to come from those countries that are enjoying growth based upon investment rather than upon their commodity riches. There's a divergence. So to assume the growth story is going to be consistent across the continent, I believe is wrong. We will see improvements in those commodity-rich countries, but the excitement is going to be elsewhere in the investment-led economies, of which I would include Rwanda, and I would include the Côte d'Ivoire, and I would include Kenya, and indeed Ethiopia. Africa today still has 5 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies, and 2/3 of the economies in this region are expanding faster than the global average. 1/3 of African economies are expanding at a rate of 5% or more. That is substantial. And it certainly belies the argument that Africa has really taken a step back from the Africa rising narrative. Again, the graphic simply shows how South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola have weighed down that average growth over the course of the last 2-3 years or so. The star nations in terms of headline GDP figures, and we can perhaps argue about the validity of some of these figures, but the IMF and the World Bank's figures for the next 2 years are pretty impressive, and the chart is up on the screen, and I'm happy to give you any of these charts if you'd like it. Ethiopia expected to do 8% at least over the next 2 years or so. Tanzania, look at those figures for Tanzania. Very, very good, but I do issue a caveat here to any of these great growth figures that we see on the screen. Wrong policy choice can upset this, and can upset this quite dramatically in terms of turning off investors and putting that investor confidence on the back burner. Still, if policies are correct, we are going to see a swathe of these African nations perform extremely well, and over the course of the next 10 years or so, we will see the Mozambiques of this world rise to a very substantial economic growth position. We will see Tanzania, again, assuming policy choices, good policy choices, Uganda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, and Ghana all remain as star performers going forward. I like Ethiopia. They've attracted foreign direct investment worth over $3 billion in the last year or so, more than Nigeria's FDI input and double that of Morocco. African nations can do it, and Ethiopia is one of them. And for all the graphs and charts that I'm willing to give you and show you, this is an important one, because it does show, and this is why I like the continent, there is a transition in these economies. There is a transition to a more services or a more diverse type of economic activity. It's not one-trick ponies anymore in Africa. And that's why I'm still bullish about the future of the continent going forward. These are economies in transition. You are all here in an economy in transition. And that's what gets me excited. But for all of that, the institutional framework has to be outstanding. The independence of institutions, the rigorous transparency and accountability, political stability has to be in place as well. There's not just an economic side of the African equation, there's a very strong institutional side that can undermine economic performance, and to a degree in my home country in South Africa, I get concerned about a deteriorating institutional environment going forward. The big challenge for Africa, I suppose, is, well, there are any number of big challenges. Power is a big challenge. Please, we have power, I must tell you, for my presentation at least. But the big challenge for me is demographic. It is the millions of young Africans who are going to come onto the job market every single year. That youth age bracket between 15 to 24 is going to mushroom, snowball, call you what you want to on this particular continent. And that concerns me. There's that old adage of a demographic dividend where young people are welcomed because they're the workers of the future. But frankly, they're only the workers of the future if there are jobs for them in the future, if the educational system maintains its standards for a tech-savvy and innovation-driven world. That, to me, will be the central challenge on this continent. And young people are going to be urbanized like never before. In the next 10 years, nearly half of all Africans are going to live in cities, and a third of the sub-Saharan African residents are going to be located in 36 cities on the continent with more than 1 million inhabitants. In the next 10 years, the populations of Lagos and Kinshasa alone will reach anywhere between 18, 19 million and 15, 16 million in these huge urban conurbations. And quickly look at this particular map, because it points out the 20 largest mega cities in the world by 2100. And where are most of them? Where are 13 of the 20 located? They are located on this continent. And it's not just Kinshasa, and it's not just Lagos. Blantyre, also in Malawi, expected to show dramatic urban growth. There's a tremendous challenge, the combination of youth employment and the effective running of cities, the management of cities. This is an aspect in which this industry really has to reach out, I believe, because many of your developments are urban-based. They're going to encounter the tensions that this urban living cycle are going to present to all of us. And I flag that as an issue for discussion, hopefully for the course of the next 2 days or so. There remains good news. The consumer environment looks relatively strong. Kenya, the Cote d'Ivoire, all doing well on every single measurement. Spending by Africa's consumers and businesses already total about $4 trillion annually. Household consumption is growing very, very healthily. The middle classes, though, and we will discuss the middle classes over the next while or so, perhaps not as substantial in quantity. Middle classes can be defined in many various ways, I must tell you. We'll discuss that in more detail. And if you have any other questions, please see me after the presentation or during the breaks, when I'll be very happy to discuss some of these issues with you. Still, the consumer-led demand based upon improvements in income and also in terms of demographic expansion, substantial. But Africa needs to change as well. The continent imports 1/3 of the food, beverages, and other similar processed goods it consumes. 60% of Africa's supply of global innovation goods are imported. This continent needs to industrialize and industrialize as rapidly as possible to create more jobs, perhaps 10 million more stable jobs than what there is at the moment. And again, I get sometimes frustrated with Africa because we don't trade enough with ourselves. In Europe, 69% of all trade is conducted within the Eurozone. In Southeast Asia, more than half of all trade conducted amongst Southeast Asian countries. But on this continent, the figure is about only 18% of all trade is conducted amongst ourselves. That to me is an issue that has to change. And indeed, we as a continent need to double our manufacturing output, especially that of manufactured products into the future, to really make our nations star nations. One caveat just towards the end of my presentation: we are entering an era of high-tech innovation. We're entering an era of artificial intelligence, and we as a continent have to be prepared to change the way we do business and look at different forms of manufacturing or other types of innovation-led technologies. That's an Adidas shoe. Many of you have got them at your home. Adidas are about now to bring jobs back to Germany. But it's not jobs for humans, it's jobs for robots. That new Adidas Speed factory in Germany will soon produce 500,000 pairs of shoes per year with only 160 workers making those 500,000 pairs of shoes. We have to be aware of those trends going forward. We have to, on this continent, formalize the informal sector that in fact amounts to about 41% of GDP. Bring the informal sector into the formal sector, get those tax receipts as well, which we so desperately need. The good news is that economic blocs look more cohesive and more ready to reform and make business easier across the continent. The good news is that African companies are growing. 700 companies on this continent with an annual revenue of more than $500 million. That's pretty impressive. We need more of these on the continent, but the foundations have been laid. Yes, I suppose, bugbears of access to finance and corruption remain the core impediments to business on the continent. And indeed, you can plot all of these factors by looking at a risk and reward index for all of these countries. And again, not surprisingly, Ethiopia performs extremely well. Tanzania, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, those countries growing well are the ones where risk is minimized and reward looks as though it's being maximized at the moment. And I'll give you some of these charts to take away. So finally, my friends, whilst some across the world seem to have a problem in understanding where countries are or what their name actually is, there's the Prince of Nambia, by the way, the rest of the world is finding this continent. Africa will record 18 million plus international arrivals. You will discuss that, and you're at the heart and the core of that in this particular industry. The tourism industry looking extremely healthy, 6% plus projected increases over the course of this year for international tourist arrivals into this continent. You'll be dealing with these stats in greater detail. And from an air passenger traffic market growth perspective, this looks like the place to be if the regulatory framework indeed keeps apace with the expected demand. Your own business in the hotel development business is healthy. 72,000 rooms expected to be added this year. The pitfalls, the challenges are all going to be part of what you will discuss. But it's pretty impressive stuff going forward and fits the narrative of the continuation of growth with the caveats that I have outlined. So 7 final points that I think this continent has to really get right in order to cement the rising narrative. It needs to mobilize domestic resources, absolutely. Countries need to do it themselves, and they need a good policy framework to do it, and they need to collect tax revenue. Those countries that have been able to tax and collect that revenue through domestic industry are the ones that are going to do well. Countries need diversification, as I've mentioned. Countries need accelerated infrastructure development, absolutely. Enhanced regional integration is on the way, I'm pleased to say, but ultimately, those young people coming on stream need to be future-proof. They need to be ready to do the work of the future, not the work of now. And they need to be enabled to innovate. And I know you will have a discussion about that during the next few days or so. Countries need to manage this urbanization phenomenon that I think is an opportunity but also a threat to destabilization. And finally, because I'm a political animal at heart, countries need to protect the integrity of their institutions and commit to greater transparency and accountability at every step of the way. It's a continent that remains a continent of great opportunity. You are in the process of taking that opportunity. Clearly, it's a question of take it or you'll miss it. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning.